What do you have to pay
How
up
much, how much
now?
longer? Yeah,
Today we're
bro.
on my persuasive
Have
speech,
to Pops get him.
and these are the three people
Pops, do you want
watching
to pick
me.
up for now? Big Pops, Big Pops, Big Pops.
Yes, yes.
Can you pick up for now?
Equal education should not depend on your zip code. Imagine two students who are exactly the same age. They're both intelligent, they're both motivated, and they both work hard and want to go to college. But one student attends school with experienced teachers, advanced classes, modern technology, counselors, and many extracurricular activities. The other student, on the other hand, attends a school with larger classes, fewer advanced courses, older technology, fewer counselors, and fewer academic opportunities. What's the difference between these two students? It may not be their intelligence, it may not be their work ethic, it might be simply because of where they live. Education is often called a great equalizer. We are told that education gives everyone the opportunity to build a better future. But how can education be an equalizer when students do not always have equal access to educational resources? Today, I'm going to talk about social justice issues of equal school funding and how it can create unequal educational opportunities. I researched information from the US Government Accountability Office, the Education Trust, and the Learning Policy Institute to better understand this issue. My purpose today is to persuade you that states should make school funding more equitable so that students have a fair opportunity to succeed regardless of wealth of the community of where they even live. First, I will explain to you the problem of unequal school resources. Second, I will explain the current school funding system and how this contributes to the inequality. Finally, I will explain a solution that will make school funding more equitable. And as we can see here, my main idea of the speech is simple on the visual aid. Equal education should not depend on your zip code. So let's start with the problem. According to the US Government Accountability Office, a lower income community generally have fewer resources available for their schools. One reason for that is that public schools receive funding from multiple sources, including local property taxes. And that becomes an issue because property wealth greatly varies from one community to another. A wealthy community may have expensive homes and large property tax bracket. A lower income community may have much less property wealth and therefore fewer local resources available for its schools. The section on my visual aid shows that how that system can even work. When property values are high, communities can generate more local revenue. When property values are low, they have fewer resources available. This does not mean that every wealthy school is excellent or that every low income school is struggling, but it does mean that communities do not necessarily start with the same amount of financial resources. And those differences can affect what students experience in the classroom. According to the Educational Trust, poverty school districts receive about 5% less in state and local revenue than low property districts. You can see that number, uh, isn't that you can see that 5% may not sound enormous at first, but when we're talking about school districts and millions of dollars, even a small percentage such as 5% can represent a significant amount of money. The Education Trust shows that districts serving the highest concentration of students of color receive about 16% less in state and local revenue than districts serving the lowest concentrations. There is one reason that this issue isn't simply about money. It's about fairness. It's about whether students' opportunity are influenced by factors they didn't even choose, like being born in a neighborhood where they raised, their family's income, and now we can actually think about school funding, what it actually should pay for. It pays for teachers, it pays for counselors, it pays for technology, it pays for advanced classes, it pays for tutoring, extracurricular activities, academic support, and other programs. And fewer resources can mean fewer opportunities. Fewer opportunities leads to harder students, making it harder for students to succeed academically. And when fewer students have fewer opportunities in school, they can face fewer opportunities later in life. So funding inequality can eventually become opportunity inequality. Now that we understand the problem, we need to ask an important question. Why does this inequality continue to exist? One major reason is the way school funding is structured. Local property wealth plays a significant role in that. If one community such has a higher property value than another, it gives have much higher tax bracket differences. And that means two schools can serve students with similar abilities and similar goals while having different financial resources. And there's another important idea we need to understand. There's a difference between equality and equity. Equality means giving everyone the exact same thing, and equity means recognizing that people have different needs and you need to provide them in a fair opportunity than just splitting it equally. For example, going back to the two schools, imagine one school is serving middle or high income families and the other serving low income families, but it has a larger number of students, they have English learners, and they have people that need academic support. Should they receive the same amount of funding? It might sound fair in that sense, but treating them exactly the same does not necessarily produce the same opportunity. The Learning Policy Institute has found that equitable and adequate school funding is associated with improved student outcomes, particularly for students from lower income families. That's why uh, that equitable funding is connected to improved student outcomes. So, what has already been worked and tried already? There have been efforts to increase educational funding and reform school finance systems, but simply increasing the amount of money spent on education has not completely eliminated the funding disparities. And simply giving every school the same amount of money doesn't solve that solution either. And if schools have different levels of need, then funding should be taken into that account. So the question we shouldn't be only asking is how much money are we spending? We should also ask where is that money going? And are the schools with the highest greater need receiving enough resources? And that leads to my solution. States should adopt stronger, equitable school funding systems. First, states should provide additional funding for students with greater need. That could include students from low income families, English learners, and people that need additional academic support. And this this goes to three major points of the solution I will be discussing. The first is to provide more funding for students with greater needs. Second is to reduce dependence on local property wealth. And the third is to ensure accountability and transparency. California provides one example of this approach. According to the Learning Policy Institute, California's Vocal Control Funding Formula, or LCFF, provides additional funding for students from low income families, English learners, and foster youth. The purpose of this type of funding is to recognize that schools do not always have the same amount of needs. And the goal is to not make every school identical because you'd be wasting money that way. The goal is to make sure every student has the resources necessary to have a fair chance to succeed. The third part of the solution is accountability. States should track where education funding goes. They should make funding information understandable to the public, and they should evaluate whether additional funding is actually improving educational opportunities for students. Because giving schools additional money only to matter if that money reaches the students who actually need it. And the final section represents what I believe the goal of education should be. A student's zip code should not determine how far they can go. Where they grow up should not determine whether your school can provide advanced classes. It shouldn't determine whether you have access to counselors. It shouldn't determine whether you have access to modern technology like laptops or academic support in that manner. So today, we looked at three major points. First, an unequal school funding can create unequal educational opportunities. Second, local property wealth and the current funding system contribute to these disparities, and treating every school the same doesn't actually solve that problem. And third, states should move toward equitable funding systems that provide greater access for resources to students and schools with greater needs. Thank you for listening to my presentation.